A blade forged in the 12th century still cuts in the 13th. The steel knows nothing of the hands that shaped it, nothing of the 3 witchers who carried it across 100 contracts, nothing of the school that no longer exists to forge its replacement. It holds an edge. It accepts the oils applied to its surface. It serves. The witchers who maintain such weapons understand what the metal cannot. They are preserving craft they can no longer recreate. Kaer Morhen's forges went cold decades ago. The masters who understood how to work meteoric iron into blades that could survive what ordinary steel could not, they died when the mob came. What knowledge survived exists in the weapons themselves, encoded in crystalline structures and rune inscriptions that cannot teach, can only demonstrate through continued function. 7 schools once forged weapons for those who hunted monsters. Each developed methods refined across generations. Each guarded techniques as jealously as any merchant protected trade secrets. When the schools fell, those techniques fell with them. What remains are the products. Swords that remember their creation in ways their wielders cannot fully comprehend. Oils prepared according to formulas passed down from teachers who learned from teachers in chains now broken. A tradition maintained not because it can be preserved, but because those who practice it know nothing else. The steel that remembers cannot speak, but the story of its making can still be told. There was a sound in the forge, not the hammer's ring against anvil, nor the hiss of quenched metal meeting water. Something quieter, a resonance that lived between the smith's final strike and the blade's first test. Those who worked iron all their lives knew this sound. They never spoke of it. The world held blades before it held witchers. Steel served kings and peasants alike, forged in 10,000 workshops across lands whose names have since been forgotten. Swords were tools, weapons, extensions of will made tangible through heat and pressure, and the knowledge passed from one calloused hand to another. They broke, they bent, they served until they could not, and then they were melted down and made again into something else. Then the conjunction came. Reality folded. Monsters poured through tears in the fabric of what had been, and when the chaos settled, the world required a different kind of blade. Steel alone would wound a necker. It would slow a ghoul. Against a wraith, it might as well have been carved from soft wood. The solution arrived slowly, built from desperate experimentation and the cold mathematics of survival. Silver harmed what steel could not, but silver was soft, too soft to hold an edge, too yielding to withstand the force of combat. A blade made purely of the metal would bend on the first parry, shatter on the second, so they learned to lie. For the silver sword, accounts describe meteoric iron forming the core, metal that had crossed the void between stars, that had survived passage through flame and friction to strike the earth intact. Around this core, smiths layered silver, not thick, just enough to poison whatever supernatural flesh it touched. The blade appeared silver. It functioned as silver, but beneath the coating lived something older, something that had endured conditions no terrestrial forge could replicate. They inscribed runes into the metal, not decoration, function carved into form, symbols borrowed from dwarven tradition, each mark a channel for intent. The runes did not make the blade magical. Magic was chaos, unpredictable, requiring talent few possessed. Runes were different. They were instructions written in a language the metal seemed to understand. A witcher's silver sword was not purely silver. It could not be. Reality imposed limits even magic struggled to overcome. The steel sword presented a different problem. Against humans, against wolves, against the bandits and deserters who plagued trade roads as thoroughly as any monster, ordinary steel sufficed. But sufficient was not the standard by which witchers survived. Their blades required an edge that held through weeks between towns where a grindstone might be found. They needed steel that would not chip when meeting armor, would not fold when turned aside by desperate parries. Fragmentary accounts suggest some smiths experimented with meteoric materials for steel blades as well, though whether this became standard practice or remained an occasional refinement is unclear from surviving sources. What is certain is that witcher steel swords were forged with exceptional care. The metal worked to standards that produced weapons noticeably superior to common blades. The crystalline structure of properly forged steel, whether from terrestrial or meteoric sources, held patterns created during tempering and shaping. It preserved, in some fundamental way, the forces that had formed it. Whether this preservation constituted remembering, in any literal sense, remained debatable. One account from the 13th century attributes to a witcher the dismissal of magical properties assigned to meteorite ore, calling such attributions astrological nonsense, wishful thinking mistaken for material science, advanced metallurgy interpreted as enchantment, exceptional craftsmanship confused with supernatural favor. Perhaps that skepticism was warranted, perhaps not. The blades performed regardless of what anyone believed about them. Oils changed everything again. Fragmentary accounts from Witcher training suggest the systematic development of blade coatings, alchemical compounds, each tailored to exploit specific vulnerabilities. The base was rendered fat, grease that would adhere to steel and silver alike, that would survive the impact of combat long enough to matter. Into this base, practitioners mixed extracts, ingredients harvested from the corpses of the very creatures the oils were designed to harm. There was chatos logic to this, cold and practical. A poison derived from a monster's own biology might bypass resistances its living kin possessed. Compounds that weakened one type of creature often proved useless against another, requiring witchers to maintain entire arsenals of preparations. The application of oil was ritual disguised as practicality. The blade cleaned first, every trace of previous coating removed. Then the fresh mixture, worked into the steel with circular motions, the oil penetrating microscopic imperfections in the metal's surface. It dried to an invisible film that would transfer its properties on contact, each successful strike depleting the coating by degrees, until nothing remained but ordinary steel that cut only as metal cuts. 12 hours, 20, 40. The duration varied with the oil's quality and the frequency of use. A witcher who fought carefully, who made each strike count, might extend a single application across multiple contracts. Another, facing swarms of lesser creatures, might exhaust the coating in a single brutal engagement. This was preparation separated from combat by hours or days. Witchers learned their bestiary the way scholars learn languages, through study, through painful repetition, through the accumulation of knowledge that might mean the difference between a completed contract and a corpse left for the crows. They identified their prey, selected the appropriate oil, applied it with the patience of those who understood that haste invited mistakes. In later years, this changed. Accounts from the 13th century describe witchers applying oils mid-combat, working by touch and trained reflex while circling opponents. Whether this represented evolution of technique or simple desperation as monster populations dwindled and contracts grew more dangerous remains unclear. The forging itself occurred in stages. First, the raw material. Meteorite ore, when available, required different handling than terrestrial iron. The inclusions that made it valuable, traces of elements created in stellar cores, also made it difficult to work. Too much heat and the metal's crystalline structure collapsed into something no better than common steel. Too little and it refused to flow, refused to accept the form the smith intended. Temperature became everything. Experienced smiths developed intuition for color, the exact shade of orange-yellow that indicated readiness, the moment when striking would shape rather than damage. They worked quickly once that moment arrived, knowing they had only seconds before the metal cooled past useful temperatures. Pattern welding, folding, techniques borrowed from older traditions, adapted to materials that behaved unlike anything smiths had previously encountered. Each fold distributed impurities, created layers that gave the blade structural integrity steel alone could not provide. The resulting patterns, visible after etching with acid, became signatures, markers of quality and the specific methods individual forges employed. For silver blades, additional complications emerged. The silver coating had to bond properly to the meteoric iron core. Too thick and the blade became heavy, unbalanced. Too thin and it wore away to expose the iron beneath, compromising the weapon's effectiveness against supernatural flesh. Smiths developed proprietary methods for achieving optimal thickness, techniques they guarded as closely as any merchant protected trade secrets. The question persisted, did the steel remember? Veterans sometimes claimed their blades knew them, knew the angle of preferred cuts, the force applied to different types of parries, the way specific witchers moved through combat. They spoke of weapons that felt natural in their hands after years of use, that responded to intention as much as physical manipulation. Whether this represented genuine connection or simply perfect familiarization, muscle memory translated into perception of the weapon's agency, none could say definitively. Blades were metal. Metal possessed no consciousness, no awareness, no capacity for memory in any conventional sense. Yet the crystalline structure of well-forged iron did preserve information. The pattern welding process created layers encoding the smith's technique. Rune inscriptions carved channels that persisted unchanged through decades of use. Oils applied and reapplied left molecular traces in microscopic imperfections. In that sense, the steel did remembered its creation, its use, the hands that had held it. Perhaps that was sufficient. Perhaps the witchers who insisted their blades listened were correct in ways they themselves did not fully understand. Metal shaped to purpose and refined through use until weapon and wielder achieved something approaching unity. That much was observable fact, rather than superstition. The oils themselves preserved knowledge. Each formula represented accumulated experience. Necrophage oil developed through encounters with ghouls, with drowners, with creatures that fed on corpses and the recently dead. Someone had tested combinations, refined proportions, documented what worked and what failed. That documentation became tradition, passed apprentice to journeyman to master, encoded in recipes that seemed simple but reflected generations of experimentation. Similar processes shaped every aspect of witchcraft. The oils, the blade care, the forging traditions, all accumulated wisdom preserved through practice rather than written record. Much was lost when the schools fell. What remained existed in the habits of survivors, knowledge that would disappear when those survivors eventually failed to return from contracts. The conjunction had changed everything about how blades were forged and for what purpose. Monsters required different steel than men, different edges, different materials, different preparations. Witchers became the bridge between old craft and new necessity. Their weapons, embodying solutions to problems that had not existed in any previous age. Now those solutions faced obsolescence. Monsters grew scarcer. The need for witchers declined. Already, traveling the path meant going weeks between contracts, accepting work ordinary sellswords would have performed. The craft that had sustained witcher schools was failing not because the knowledge was lost, but because the world no longer required what that knowledge produced. Perhaps the steel remembered that too, remembered its purpose becoming irrelevant, its edge maintained for battles that came less frequently, its runes inscribed for a world that was passing even as the metal remained sharp and ready. A blade knows nothing, believes nothing, cares for nothing. It cuts what it is designed to cut until the metal fails, or the world no longer requires cutting. Whether this constitutes memory depends entirely on how one defines the term. The witchers themselves rarely philosophized about such matters. They maintained their weapons because survival required it. They applied oils because monsters died faster when properly prepared. They commissioned blades from smiths who understood specialized metalworking because such blades lasted longer than alternatives. If the steel listened, it listened to necessity. If it remembered service. Nothing more complex. Nothing requiring mystical connection or supernatural bond. Simply metal performing the function for which it had been created, maintained by those who understood that their lives depended on that performance remaining reliable. The maintenance never ceased. A blade required attention after every contract. Blood, particularly monster blood, corroded steel and silver alike. Compounds in some creatures' fluids reacted with metal, creating pitting that weakened structural integrity. Witchers learned to clean their weapons immediately, before exhaustion or celebration could tempt them to delay. Sharpening occurred regularly, not obsessively. Overhoning reduced a blade's lifespan, but with a consistency that prevented catastrophic edge failure during combat. Whetstones traveled alongside oils and potions, tools as essential as the weapons themselves. Grindstones existed in larger towns, operated by smiths who charged for their use. A witcher who had access would spend hours restoring edges worn by weeks of travel and fighting. Others made do with portable equipment, accepting that field maintenance produced inferior results to proper workshop treatment. This attention to craft distinguished professionals from amateurs. Any fool could swing a sword. Keeping that sword functional through seasons of heavy use required knowledge, patience, and the willingness to perform unglamorous work, while others celebrated contracts completed. Swords broke, not often, but inevitably. A blade stressed beyond its limits, struck at a bad angle, exposed to forces its metallurgy could not withstand. Failure modes varied, but outcomes remained constant. Steel shattered, silver peeled away from core metal, Weeks or months of reliable service ended in an instant. Witchers learned to recognize warning signs, stress fractures visible only in certain light, minute deformations indicating imminent failure. The maintenance rituals served dual purpose, keeping weapons functional while also identifying those approaching the end of their service life. A broken blade required replacement, not repair. Attempting to weld meteoric materials rarely succeeded. The resulting weapon compromised in ways that made it dangerous to wield. Replacement meant either commissioning a new weapon, if smiths and materials could be found, or retrieving a spare if one existed. Many witchers maintained backup weapons for precisely this eventuality. The forge makes the blade. Use gives it purpose. Maintenance extends its service. Eventually, even the finest steel fails. This cycle repeated across centuries. Forges producing weapons for wielders who would inevitably require replacements. Knowledge of how to create and maintain these weapons existed as long as those who possessed it survived. The mountains held the first forge. Morgrave Castle stood in the Kestrel Range, built by those who first attempted to create witchers from boys through alchemical mutation and brutal training. Mages worked alongside knights and master-at-arms, each contributing expertise toward a single purpose, producing hunters capable of facing what ordinary soldiers could not. The Order of Witchers began there. In the 10th century, when monsters still poured freely from places where the Conjunction's wounds had not fully healed, the need seemed absolute. Create predators to hunt predators. Transform children into weapons that breathed and thought and died hard. They succeeded. The methods worked after a fashion. Boys entered training and emerged changed, if they emerged at all. Faster than men, stronger, senses heightened to the edge of pain, immune to toxins that would drop a horse, capable of channeling chaos through hand gestures called signs, though the power was crude compared to what trained mages wielded. The swords they carried were forged to meet their specific needs. Steel for common threats, silver for supernatural ones. The distinction seemed clear then. Before experience taught more nuanced lessons, the order did not last. Internal conflicts emerged. Disagreements over methods, over purpose, over how witches should conduct themselves when not actively hunting. Some advocated for a knightly code, honor and service elevated above mere contract work. Others saw witchers as professionals first, bound to no code except reliable completion of paid assignments. The divisions deepened, groups splintered away, taking knowledge and equipment with them. What remained of the order grew weaker with each departure, until finally the last members abandoned Morgrave entirely, traveling east to establish something new in the Morhen Valley. The schools that emerged from these fractures each developed their own approach to the craft. Details about their specific founding and practices come largely from sources compiled in the 13th century and later, particularly documentation preserved by those who studied Witcher history after the schools had already fallen. What follows represents the understanding preserved in those sources, though primary documentation from the schools themselves is fragmentary. The School of the Bear is described in these later sources as among the first splinter groups. Said to have been founded by a witcher named Arnagod, the Bears reportedly settled in the Amel Mountains. Their approach favored raw strength over finesse, heavy armor, brutal, overwhelming force, fighting styles that prioritized ending combat quickly through sheer physical dominance. Based on weapons that survived from this period, blades associated with bear techniques were indeed heavier than those other schools produced, with broader profiles designed to deliver maximum force with each strike. Whether this reflected deliberate philosophical choice or simply regional forging traditions remains open to interpretation. The forging process, as reconstructed from surviving examples, emphasized durability over all other considerations. Bears expected their weapons to survive impacts that would shatter lighter blades. Testing methods apparently involved subjecting finished products to stresses no reasonable combat would produce, striking stone, bending the flat of the blade to extreme angles. Only weapons that survived this treatment were deemed acceptable. This approach produced remarkably reliable weapons. A bear's blade might lack the elegant balance of other schools' work, might feel crude to hands trained in faster fighting styles. But when that blade struck, it struck with authority that left little ambiguity about outcomes. Bears trained alone more often than in groups, based on what fragmentary accounts suggest. Their school never developed the pack mentality that characterized some others. Each witcher operated as an independent unit, self-sufficient, and requiring nothing from his brothers except that they stay out of his territory. This isolation extended to their forging traditions, with little evidence of systematic knowledge sharing even among members of the same school. The School of the Viper is described as emerging from the bears themselves. According to sources, a witcher named Ivar Evil Eye led the group that split away to form their own school in the Tir Tochair Mountains. The separation was not amicable. Whether the details of this founding accurately reflect historical events or represent later mythologizing is difficult to determine. Vipers, as characterized in available accounts, took the bear philosophy and adapted it toward different ends. Where bears emphasized straightforward overwhelming force, vipers developed reputation for poison and ambush. Their blades were narrower, designed for precision strikes to vulnerable points rather than crushing impacts. The forging, based on analysis of attributed weapons, adapted accordingly. Viper swords prioritized edge retention and flexibility. A blade might bend considerably without breaking, springing back to true once pressure was released. This flexibility allowed techniques that would snap more rigid weapons. They also reportedly pioneered the use of paired daggers alongside traditional swords. These smaller weapons could be coated with the actual poisons, creating backup weapons that required only a scratch to prove lethal. The metallurgy for such blades differed from sword forging: thinner cross-sections, more acute edge angles, acceptance of shorter working life in exchange for extreme sharpness. Vipers maintained no central forge, if available evidence is accurate. Their school's scattered nature meant each witcher learned to work with local smiths, developing relationships with craftsmen in whatever region they operated. This created remarkable diversity in Viper weapons. No two looked quite alike, each reflecting the traditions of different workshops across the continent. The School of the Manticore is said to have split from the Vipers in turn. According to what documentation exists, they settled near the borders of Zerrikania, in desert lands where different rules applied. Manticores would have adapted their craft to extreme conditions: heat that made tempering unpredictable, sand that wore edges faster than any other environment, creatures that existed nowhere else on the continent. The limited examples that can be attributed to Manticore origin suggest forging that emphasized resistance to environmental degradation, treatments that sealed the metal's surface against sand infiltration, silver coatings thicker than standard, accepting the weight penalty to prevent the coating from being scoured away by desert winds. Whether these adaptations represented standard Manticore practice or individual innovations by specific smiths working in desert conditions remains uncertain. The school's remote location and eventual dissolution mean much of their specific craft knowledge was never documented comprehensively. The School of the Cat took a different path entirely. This school's existence is better documented, with references appearing in multiple sources from the mid-13th century. Founded by members who departed from the order, bringing alchemical materials with them, Cats established themselves in Stygia Citadel, far to the south. Their reputation for speed and precision is consistent across various accounts. Cat blades that have been examined do show characteristics consistent with their reputation: lighter construction, thinner cross-sections, reduced weight overall. The weapons feel almost fragile compared to heavier school designs, but examination of their metallurgy reveals sophisticated understanding of how to achieve strength without mass. This lightness came at documented cost. Cat swords required more frequent maintenance, the thinner metal more susceptible to stress and damage under heavy use. Records from the period note: Cats accepting these limitations as reasonable trade-offs for the speed advantages their fighting style demanded. The school's documented willingness to train non-humans and women created unique requirements. Blades needed to be custom-fitted to individual wielders more precisely than other schools typically practiced. This specialization is evident in surviving examples, each showing subtle variations in balance and proportion. Cat smiths developed expertise in custom fitting that other schools never matched. Each blade was tailored to its intended wielder with precision that bordered on obsessive. The time and expense this required meant cat weapons were rarely interchangeable. A sword forged for one witcher might prove nearly unusable for another, even if both came from the same school. This specialization created vulnerability. When Stygia Citadel fell and the school fragmented, much of their forging knowledge scattered with the survivors. The mobile headquarters they eventually established could not support full forging operations. Cats learned to make do. To maintain weapons far beyond the point, other schools would have replaced them. To adapt blades originally designed for different hands. The The School of the Griffin attempted to preserve the Order's original ideals. Multiple sources describe Erland of Larvik and companions leaving what remained of the Order to establish a school dedicated to maintaining knightly values. They traveled to Kaer Morhen, a fortress previously used in early Witcher experiments, and established operations focused on magical training alongside combat skills. Griffin forging emphasized balance between competing priorities. Surviving Griffin blades show remarkable versatility in design, capable of serving multiple fighting styles effectively. The school's emphasis on sign work may have influenced their approach to metallurgy, though whether this produced measurably different weapons or simply reflected different training priorities is difficult to determine from physical evidence alone. Sources suggest Griffins paid particular attention to how different alloys and forging methods affected a blade's resonance with chaos. Whether this represented genuine magical enhancement or simply exceptional understanding of material properties remained debated even among Witchers of that era. Griffins maintained an extensive library at Kaer Morhen, including detailed documentation of forging techniques. This represented unusual practice among Witcher schools, most of which passed knowledge through demonstration rather than written record. The library's destruction during an avalanche, whether natural disaster or deliberate attack remains debated, eliminated much of this accumulated wisdom permanently. The School of the Wolf was last to form, inheritors of what remained after everyone else had left. Those who stayed behind in Morgrey eventually abandoned the fortress, traveling north to the Morhen Valley. There they established Kaer Morhen, a keep that would become strongly associated with Witchers in later popular understanding. Wolf forging was pragmatic. The weapons balanced multiple concerns without optimizing excessively for any single factor. Durable enough to survive heavy use, light enough for extended combat, simple enough that field maintenance required no specialist tools. Wolf blades were professional instruments for professional work. The school's northern location created specific challenges. Winter lasted longer in the mountains, making the journey to Kaer Morhen impossible for months at a time. This enforced isolation meant Wolf Witchers spent winters at the keep, using that time for training, maintenance, and weapon creation. The forges at Kaer Morhen were built utilizing the mountain's natural features for ventilation and heat management. Young Witchers learned basic smithing alongside combat, understanding that self-sufficiency improved survival prospects on the path. Wolves also maintained relationships with dwarven smiths in nearby settlements when possible. These connections provided access to expertise wolfsmiths might lack, particularly regarding rune inscription and specialized treatments. Collaboration between Witcher and dwarven craft produced weapons that combined both traditions' strengths. Kaer Morhen suffered a massacre in the late 12th century. An angry mob led by mages and priests attacked the keep, killing those present. The slaughter was comprehensive. When it ended, much knowledge had been destroyed, including detailed understanding of the trial of the grasses, the alchemical process that transformed boys into Witchers. The forges survived structurally, but the masters who had operated them did not. Later generations of Wolf Witchers could maintain weapons and perform repairs, but deeper expertise was gone. They learned what they could from surviving examples, but much was lost irretrievably. Each school developed preferences regarding rune inscription. The art originated with dwarves, whose languages contained sounds and structures that resonated with certain materials. Carved into metal following specific patterns, these symbols could enhance or alter properties without requiring the carver to possess magical talent. The mechanism remained disputed. Some insisted runes simply exploited natural resonances through precisely calibrated geometry. Others argued the symbols themselves carried inherent power, that proper inscription opened channels to forces beyond normal comprehension. For practical purposes, the distinction mattered little. Properly inscribed runes produced measurable effects. Improperly inscribed runes did nothing, or worse, created structural weaknesses. Rune writes commanded high fees for their services. The work required precision most smiths never achieved. A rune placed slightly off-center, carved to incorrect depth, or following wrong sequence might compromise the entire weapon. Based on surviving examples, schools approach rune work differently. Weapons attributed to wolf origin typically show conservative rune patterns, enhancing general combat effectiveness. Those identified as catwork favor runes, emphasizing speed and precision. Griffin examples sometimes show runes that appear designed to complement sign work, though whether this represents genuine magical synergy or simply different aesthetic preferences is difficult to verify. The process of inscription itself was precise to the point of ritual. The blade had to be perfectly clean, every trace of oil or oxidation removed. Temperature mattered. Too hot and the metal would flow unpredictably. Too cold and achieving proper depth became difficult without risking the blade's temper. Runewrights worked slowly, often spending hours on a single symbol. They used specialized tools ground to specific angles, waited for precise impact. The work demanded absolute focus. A single mistake might ruin weeks of prior effort. Once inscribed, runes were typically filled with contrasting material to make them visible. Gold for prestigious weapons, silver for those less elaborate, simple oxidation for purely functional blades. This filling served aesthetic rather than functional purpose, though some claimed the choice of filling material could influence the rune's effectiveness. The runes themselves drew from multiple traditions. Dwarven symbols predominated, but elven characters appeared occasionally, particularly on weapons commissioned in regions where elven influence remained strong. Some smiths experimented with hybrid systems, combining elements from different traditions to produce novel effects. Whether these experiments succeeded was difficult to determine. A blade that performed well might owe its quality to superior base metallurgy, rather than innovative rune work. One that failed might have been flawed in forging rather than in inscription. Isolating variables proved nearly impossible, leaving much of runecraft in the realm of tradition and educated guessing. The schools fell one by one. Kaer Morhen's massacre was only the beginning. Political conflicts, anti-Witcher sentiment, simple accidents of history. Each school faced its own crisis. Some dissolved gradually as members died and were not replaced. Others ended in violence. A few simply scattered, their Witchers choosing individual survival over institutional loyalty. The forges went cold. Knowledge that had been passed smith to apprentice for generations disappeared with those who held it. Blades continued to function, but when they broke, replacement became increasingly difficult. By the mid-13th century, the age of Witcher schools had effectively ended. What remained were individuals scattered across the continent, maintaining weapons whose creation they only partially understood. They cleaned and sharpened, applied oils according to formulas passed down from teachers who were themselves poorly informed. The blades continued to serve, but the full context of their creation had been lost. Some knowledge survived in unexpected places. Dwarven smiths who had worked with Witchers remembered techniques, though they lacked the specific understanding of how Witchers used their weapons. Runewrights retained their craft, though their services were rarely sought once their primary customers vanished. Scattered notes and partial documentation existed in libraries and private collections, fragments of a larger tradition now irretrievably fractured. The steel remembered what the people forgot. The crystalline structure of well-forged iron preserved patterns of forging technique. The runes inscribed decades earlier remained potent, their effects unchanged by the passage of time or the death of those who had placed them. The knowledge encoded in metal persisted even as the knowledge in mines faded. This created a peculiar situation. Witchers in the latter 13th century carried weapons superior to anything they could produce themselves. Their blades represented craft from the school's prime, forged by masters who had understood the work completely. Maintaining such weapons became paramount. Each blade that broke was irreplaceable. Its loss a permanent reduction in capability. Some Witchers hoarded spare weapons, collecting blades from the dead and storing them against future need. This practice was practical, but also melancholy. Each stored weapon represented another Witcher who had failed to return from a contract. Others established relationships with smiths who showed some understanding of Witcher weapons, even if that understanding was incomplete. These craftsmen could produce functional blades, could maintain edges and repair minor damage, could apply silver coating that would last at least a few seasons. The work was inferior to what the schools had produced, but inferior was better than nothing. The question of what would happen when the last school forged blade finally broke remained unspoken. By the time that occurred, would any Witchers remain to require replacement? Monsters grew scarcer each year. The profession was dying not from lack of skill, but from lack of work. Perhaps the blades would outlast those who wielded them. The forges stood empty. Kaer Morhen's workshops remained structurally sound, but cold. Their bellows silent, their anvils gathering dust. The few Witchers who still wintered there walked past the forges without entering. What would be the purpose? They could maintain what they had, but create nothing new. The knowledge was gone. In certain dwarven settlements, old smiths still knew fragments of the craft. They could look at a witcher blade and recognize forging patterns, identify which school and approximately which decade of production. This expertise was academic now, useful for appraisal but not for replication. The skills required to produce such weapons had been refined over generations. No single smith, no matter how talented, could reconstruct that accumulated expertise from examination of finished products alone. The steel that remembered could not teach. It preserved information in its structure, but could not translate that information into knowledge a human or dwarf could apply. The crystalline patterns meant nothing without understanding of how those patterns were created. The runes remained potent but mute, their power evident but their inscription process lost. Some traditions survived in degraded form. Smiths in certain regions still forged what they called witcher blades, weapons that superficially resembled true witcher work, but lacked the essential characteristics that made the originals exceptional. These blades served after a fashion. They killed monsters if the wielder was skilled and the monster was not too formidable, but they were shadows of what had been, adequate where once there had been excellence. The oils and their application persisted more successfully. Alchemy required less specialized equipment than forging, could be practiced by individuals with access to ingredients and basic laboratory tools. Formulas were copied and recopied, passed along through informal networks of those who still required them. The knowledge suffered some degradation, refinements were forgotten, optimal proportions lost, ingredient substitutions made without full understanding of what was being sacrificed, but the core practice remained viable. This meant a witcher in the 1260s could still prepare his blades properly, even if those blades themselves were irreplaceable relics. The combination of old metal and maintained technique allowed continued function even as the tradition that had produced both slowly dissolved. The watching world cared little for these losses. Common folk had never understood the work that went into witcher weapons, saw only the finished product and the results it produced. That the craft was dying meant nothing to those who were glad to see fewer witchers on the roads. The blades were dangerous because those who carried them were dangerous. Their disappearance was welcome. Witchers understood differently. Each blade that broke was history ending. Each oil formula lost was accumulated wisdom becoming inaccessible. They maintained what they had with the care of those who knew they were preserving a tradition they could not restore. The steel remembered, the people forgot, and the world continued turning, indifferent to both. The oil began with fat. Accounts from those familiar with witcher practices describe preparations beginning with specific rendered fats, chosen for properties that affected how well they held alchemical compounds in suspension. Bear fat reportedly maintained oils at stable temperatures without separation. Grease spread evenly across steel. Dog fat, despite the distaste its harvest provoked, absorbed alchemical compounds more readily than alternatives. The base determined whether the final preparation would remain effective or degrade. The compounds added to this base, according to available sources, came from the monsters themselves. Descriptions suggest necrophage oil required tissue from creatures that fed on corpses, materials from ghouls, drowners, and similar beings. Each ingredient contributed properties that proved effective against related species. The logic was brutal and direct. Harvest from the dead to kill the living. How precisely these formulations were developed is unclear from surviving documentation. The recipes that have been recorded specify ingredients and procedures but rarely explain the reasoning behind specific choices. This suggests the knowledge was passed through demonstration rather than theoretical instruction, with underlying principles lost even as the practical applications remained effective. A witcher preparing necrophage oil would follow established formulas, mixing rendered fat with processed monster tissues, according to specifications passed down from his training. Whether he understood the chemistry involved, or simply knew that following the recipe produced useful results, varied by individual. The preparation process, as described in sources familiar with the practice, required careful attention to sequence and timing. Ingredients were processed in specific order. Some required heating to extract active compounds, with temperatures controlled to prevent degradation. Others work best when processed cold, their useful properties destroyed by thermal stress. Grinding, filtering, distillation, each step removed impurities while concentrating desired elements. The fat was melted, brought to temperature, held steady, while compounds were introduced one by one. Timing mattered, according to available accounts. Add the next ingredient too soon, and it might react with the previous addition, creating useless byproducts. Wait too long, and the base would cool below optimal suspension temperature, refusing to hold new additions properly. Witchers learned to judge readiness by observation. The way liquid moved in the vessel, subtle color changes indicating chemical reactions had completed, even the smell as volatile compounds formed and stabilized. The work required focus and patience. Rushing produced inferior results. Carelessness produced dangerous ones. Once complete, the mixture cooled slowly. Rapid temperature change could cause separation, the careful suspension collapsing into stratified layers. Properly prepared oil remained homogeneous, the active compounds distributed evenly throughout the fat matrix. It could be stored for extended periods without degradation, each application providing consistent performance. The variety of oils documented in later sources matches the variety of creatures that required hunting. Whether all these formulations existed during the school's prime, or whether some were developed later by individual practitioners, adapting to changing circumstances is difficult to determine. The documentation is incomplete, and claims about specific oils' origins should be understood as representing what later sources recorded, rather than verified historical fact. Spectre oil, as described in available accounts, was formulated to affect incorporeal beings. The reported ingredients included materials harvested from specters themselves, essence collected from manifestation sites before it could dissipate, combined with specific mineral compounds that somehow maintained potency against creatures existing partially outside normal physical reality. Vampire oil, according to sources, required blood, not from vampires directly, as their blood was too unstable, but from their victims under specific circumstances. The chemistry supposedly involved concentrating traces of vampire saliva found in victim blood, creating compounds that proved toxic to vampire physiology. Higher vampires presented additional complications based on what accounts survive. They were not purely magical creatures, but beings with complex biology that resisted simple toxins. Oils effective against lesser vampires proved nearly useless against more powerful variants. Specialized formulations existed, but the ingredients required were rare and their procurement dangerous. Insectoid oil targeted creatures whose chitinous exteriors resisted conventional weapons. According to available descriptions, the oil did not soften chitin directly, but instead exploited joints and sensory organs. Compounds derived from the creature's own biology triggered confusion, caused pain responses that made them vulnerable. Beast oil worked against wolves, bears, and similar creatures. These were not monsters in the strictest sense. They existed before the conjunction, required no magical vulnerability to be killed. But Witcher contracts sometimes involve such animals, particularly when they grew abnormally large or aggressive. Beast oil was formulated more simply than those targeting supernatural creatures, relying on irritants and mild toxins rather than compounds exploiting magical biology. Hangman's venom was specialized for humans. Its existence posed moral questions Witchers answered individually. Some refused to prepare it, considering its use a step toward assassination rather than monster hunting. Others maintained supplies, reasoning that contracts sometimes required killing men as dangerous as any creature. The divide reflected different philosophies about what Witchers were supposed to be. The oil itself, based on available formulas, was not particularly complex. Its active ingredients came from plants rather than monsters, toxins that affected human nervous systems, compounds that interfered with blood clotting, substances that caused intense pain without immediately proving lethal. Applied to a blade, Hangman's venom made wounds that should have been superficial become incapacitating or fatal. Its name derived from the gallows tradition. Certain plants grew best in soil fertilized by decomposing bodies, their roots drawing nutrients from the hanged. Whether this affected the plant's chemical properties or simply represented convenient harvesting locations remained unclear. The association persisted regardless, linking the oil to executions and judicial violence. Application technique varied between individual Witchers, though the basic method remained consistent across sources. Clean the blade thoroughly. Apply the oil in thin, even layers. Allow it to dry partially before use. But the specifics of how one cleaned, what materials were employed, how much oil constituted the correct amount, these details were personal, refined through experience until each Witcher developed methods that worked for him. Some heated their blades slightly before application, claiming warmth helped the oil penetrate surface irregularities. Others insisted this degraded the compounds, that room temperature application produced superior results. Evidence, such as it exists, could be interpreted to support both positions depending on oil type, ambient conditions, and blade metallurgy. The dried coating was nearly invisible, a film measured in fractions of a millimeter. Running fingers along the blade would reveal slight tackiness, resistance suggesting the steel's surface had changed texture. The layer transferred on contact with flesh, active compounds penetrating to trigger reactions that would continue even after the blade was withdrawn. Enough strikes depleted the coating entirely. Witchers tracked applications through experience, developing intuition for how many strikes particular oils survived. 20 against creatures whose skin was relatively soft, based on what practitioners reported. Perhaps 10 against a creature whose scales were armor equivalent. The counting was never precise, but it was reliable enough. Reapplication in the field became necessary during extended contracts. A witcher hunting a nest of creatures might exhaust his blade's coating halfway through the extermination. If he carried spare oil and could find brief respite, reapplication was possible, though not ideal. Field conditions made achieving proper coverage difficult. Rushed application produced inferior results, but inferior results were better than no enhancement at all. The knowledge required to prepare oils properly was extensive, according to sources that described the practice. Identifying correct ingredients meant understanding monster anatomy. A witcher needed to recognize specific organs by sight and smell, distinguish them from similar tissues whose use would not produce desired effects. This required handling corpses, often in advanced states of decay, searching through decomposing flesh for specific components while fighting off scavengers attracted by the carnage. Extracting ingredients without contamination required basic understanding of anatomy and careful technique. Cutting into a creature's body to retrieve its organs was straightforward in principle, but complicated by unfamiliar biology. Learning where to cut, how deep, what to avoid, this came through practice and frequent mistakes. Preservation techniques ensured ingredients remained viable during transport. Organs from many creatures began degrading immediately upon death. Without proper treatment, they became useless within hours. Witchers carried preserving agents, salts, alcohols, oils that prevented oxidation, and applied them immediately after harvest. Even so, ingredients had limited working life. The alchemy itself required portable equipment, glass vessels for mixing and storage, heat sources that could be controlled precisely, grinding implements for reducing solid ingredients to powder, filtration materials for removing impurities. A traveling alchemist's kit weighed considerably, enough that witchers often left some components behind when they expected contracts requiring only steel and skill, rather than chemical preparation. Some oils could be purchased from herbalists or alchemists in larger towns, according to period accounts. These commercial preparations were rarely equivalent to what witchers made themselves. The formulas were simplified, the ingredients substituted, the quality control insufficient for reliable combat performance. Desperate witchers used them when no alternative existed, but preference always ran towards self-prepared oils made according to proper specifications. Bestiary knowledge formed the foundation of effective oil selection. A witcher who could not identify his target stood little chance of preparing appropriately. The bestiaries maintained by witcher schools contained accumulated knowledge about hundreds of species, appearance, behavior, habitat preferences, dietary patterns, known vulnerabilities. Much of this information was relevant to oil formulation, allowing practitioners to select appropriate preparations based on observed characteristics. These documents were guarded carefully. A bestiary represented generations of accumulated experience, paid for with lives lost while learning what worked and what didn't. When schools fell, their bestiaries were among the most valuable losses. Some survived in fragmentary form, copied by those who escaped destruction. Others vanished entirely, their contents lost except for what individual witchers remembered from training. By the mid-13th century, bestiary knowledge had degraded noticeably. Witchers still active might remember entries they'd studied decades earlier, but memory was imperfect. Details confused between similar species. Vulnerabilities half-remembered might be entirely wrong. The infrastructure that had maintained and updated this knowledge no longer existed. This created situations where witchers hunted creatures they did not fully understand, relying on best guesses and general principles rather than specific documented weaknesses. Success rates declined. Contracts that should have been straightforward became dangerous. The gap between what witchers of previous generations could accomplish and what current practitioners managed widened steadily. Oils partially compensated for this degradation. Even without perfect bestiary knowledge, a witcher could prepare several different oils covering broad categories. Necrophage oil worked against multiple related species. Spectre oil handled various incorporeal threats. The preparations were not optimized for any specific creature, but they provided some advantage against entire families of related monsters. This generalist approach sacrificed effectiveness for reliability. A specialized oil formulated specifically for one creature type would outperform generic preparation significantly. But if the contract turned out to involve a slightly different variant, that specialized preparation became less useful, while the generic version retained effectiveness. Witchers balanced specificity against flexibility based on available information and personal risk tolerance. The interaction between oils and runes was poorly understood, based on what fragmentary accounts exist. Blades that carried runic inscriptions sometimes reacted unpredictably when coated with certain oils. The effects might be enhanced. A rune that increased cutting power synergizing with oil to produce results greater than either alone should produce, or they might interfere, the oil's chemical activity somehow disrupting whatever forces the runes channeled, resulting in diminished performance from both. No systematic study of these interactions existed in accessible records. Individual witchers noticed patterns, developed preferences for which oils they applied to runed versus plain blades. But comprehensive understanding required research infrastructure the schools had never prioritized, and certainly could not maintain after their dissolution. In practice, according to available accounts, witchers applied oils to whatever blades they carried, regardless of runic status. If problems arose, if a weapon performed worse than expected, they noted it and avoided that specific combination in future. The approach was empirical and inefficient, but workable given the limitations under which they operated. The teaching of oil preparation was central to witcher training, based on descriptions that survive. Young witchers spent considerable time in workshops learning to identify ingredients, practicing extraction and preservation, preparing oils under supervision until they could produce reliable results independently. This training was grueling and frequently disgusting. Handling monster corpses in various states of decay, breathing fumes from alchemical reactions, discovering through painful experience which compounds burned skin on contact, all were part of the education. The training also emphasized safety. Many alchemical ingredients were toxic to humans, some lethally so. A witcher's mutations provide some protection, but not complete immunity. Careless handling killed. Proper procedure included protective measures, covering skin when harvesting, ensuring ventilation when processing, careful labeling of stored materials to prevent accidental exposure. Young witchers who showed aptitude for alchemy sometimes specialized, becoming more skilled than their peers at oil preparation. These specialists could produce superior formulations, identify subtle quality differences in ingredients, troubleshoot problems when standard procedures failed. In functioning schools, they served as resources for others, maintaining communal supplies and teaching refinements to newer students. After the schools fell, such specialists became even more valuable. A witcher who carried advanced alchemical knowledge was better equipped to survive independently, could prepare oils from marginal ingredients other practitioners would reject as unusable. The degradation of this knowledge followed predictable patterns, based on what can be inferred from the profession's decline. First generation after school closure, those trained before dissolution, retained full expertise. They could prepare oils to original specifications, understood the reasoning behind each step, could improvise when standard ingredients were unavailable. Second generation, those trained by first generation survivors, learned procedures but not always the principles. They could follow formulas reliably but struggled to adapt when circumstances required deviation from established protocols. Their oils worked, but the tradition was already eroding. Third generation, trained by those with incomplete knowledge, worked from increasingly corrupted formulas. Substitutions made by previous generations were not recognized as substitutions, became treated as original specifications. Techniques that were actually workarounds for missing equipment or ingredients were taught as correct methods. The oils still functioned, but performance degraded measurably. Whether the profession would persist long enough for fourth and fifth generations to exist remained uncertain. The craft itself was dying. Oils might become extinct not because the knowledge was lost, but because no one remained who required them. Certain oils required ingredients that were becoming unobtainable. As monster populations declined, the materials witchers needed for oil preparation grew scarcer. A A creature that had been common enough to harvest routinely might become rare enough that killing one for alchemical ingredients seemed wasteful. Witchers faced choices between immediate practical needs and long-term conservation of species they had spent their lives hunting. Some began stockpiling ingredients when they found them, preserving materials against future scarcity. This was imperfect. Solution: many components degraded in storage regardless of preservation method. Materials kept for years lacked potency of fresh components, but degraded ingredients were better than none. Others experimented with synthetic alternatives, attempting to create alchemical compounds that mimicked monster-derived substances without requiring actual monster tissues. Results were mixed. Some substitutes worked adequately, others failed completely. The chemistry involved was complex, the knowledge required to make progress largely absent among witchers, whose training emphasized practical application over theoretical understanding. The problem would resolve itself eventually. When too few witchers remained to represent viable practice, when too few monsters existed to make hunting them economically rational, the entire system would collapse. Oils would become historical curiosity, described in old books but no longer prepared by anyone. The blades would lose one of the key advantages that had made witcher weapons distinctive. Until then, those who still walked the path maintained their practice. They harvested when they could. They prepared according to formulas passed down through chains, extending back to the school's founding. They applied their oils to blades that were themselves relics of vanished traditions, creating temporary synergy between endangered crafts. The steel accepted the coating without preference or judgment. It cut what it was directed to cut, the oil's enhancement making that cutting more effective for as long as chemistry lasted. When the coating exhausted itself, the steel remained unchanged, ready to accept new preparation or to serve unaided. The blade would outlast the oils. Probably it would outlast those who applied them. Somewhere in dusty workshops, jars of prepared oils sat unused. Their creators had died on contracts or simply disappeared. No one remained who knew those specific formulas, could identify the subtle variations that made each practitioner's work distinctive. The jars would sit until their contents degraded beyond recovery, until someone cleared the space and discarded them unknowing. The knowledge lived only in practice. When practice ceased, knowledge followed. The oils that enhanced witcher blades would vanish as completely as the schools that taught their preparation, leaving only fragmentary documentation and stories about hunters whose weapons poisoned with every cut. For now, a witcher might still prepare necrophage oil in a rented room, might still apply it carefully to well-forged steel, before riding out to honor contracts negotiated in taverns that smelled of fear and desperation. The tradition continued. How much longer it would continue? Years, decades, perhaps only months. No one could predict. The steel remembered nothing of these concerns. It held an edge. It accepted enhancement. It served until it could not. Beyond that, the metal had no opinion about the forces that had created it, or the uncertain future awaiting those who maintained it. The last sword forged at Kaer Morhen during the school's functional period was created sometime in the early to mid-13th century. The exact date has not survived in accessible records. Not the last blade the fortress ever held, but the last made within its workshops by those trained completely to the craft. The steel was carefully selected, worked by a smith whose name has not been preserved. The blade served its witcher for decades before he failed to return from a contract. What happened to the sword afterward is unknown. By the 1270s, Kaer Morhen's forges were cold. The few witchers who still wintered there walked past the workshops without entering. The tools remained where they had been left, arranged neatly by those who had expected to return to them. Hammers rested on anvils that would never again ring with impact. Bellows hung silent, their leather cracking in air that no longer carried the forge's heat. The knowledge of how to use those tools had departed with those who possessed it. The surviving witchers understood maintenance, could sharpen blades, and perform minor repairs. Creating new weapons from raw materials exceeded their capabilities. The expertise required had been refined over generations, transmitted through demonstration and supervised practice. Written documentation existed incompletely at best. A skilled smith, examining the tools and studying what fragmentary notes remained, might recreate some techniques, but not all. Not enough. This situation replicated itself wherever witcher schools had operated. Forges built to produce specialized weapons stood idle. The traditions that had sustained them were broken. What remained were the products of those traditions. Swords still in use, maintained by those who understood them incompletely. irreplaceable. A blade commissioned from a smith ignorant of Witcher specifications would be inferior in ways that might prove fatal. Weight distribution would be wrong, making the weapon handle unpredictably. The steel would be standard quality, lacking the characteristics that granted superior edge retention. Silver coating, if applied at all, would not bond properly to the core metal. The result would be a sword, technically, but not a Witcher's sword. Some smiths claimed expertise in Witcher weapons based on having examined examples or worked on minor repairs. Their products were better than completely ignorant work, but still fell short of school standards. A Witcher desperate enough might commission such a blade, accepting inferior quality because the alternative was operating with a broken weapon. These second-rate swords served after a fashion. They killed monsters if the wielder was skilled, and the monster was not too formidable. But they represented degradation of craft that had once produced exceptional results reliably. The oils fared somewhat better. Alchemy required less specialized infrastructure than metalworking, could be practiced wherever ingredients and basic equipment could be obtained. The formulas themselves were more readily documented, lists of components and procedures that could be copied even by those who did not fully understand underlying principles. This portability meant alchemical knowledge degraded more slowly than forging expertise. A Witcher in the 1270s might prepare oils nearly equivalent to those made decades earlier in school workshops. Might, if he had access to proper ingredients, if he had learned technique correctly, if he maintained standards despite operating in isolation without peer review or guidance. But even here, erosion was visible. Ingredients substituted through necessity became standard practice. Shortcuts taken when time was scarce were taught as correct procedure. The craft remained functional, but had clearly declined from its peak. The few Witchers still active by the 1270s carried blades forged decades earlier by smiths who had understood the work completely. They maintained these weapons with the care of those who knew replacement was impossible. Each blade was a relic, a physical connection to traditions that had produced it, but could no longer be sustained. These Witchers met occasionally, crossing paths at taverns where contracts were negotiated, or at sites where multiple hunters pursued the same dangerous prey. They recognized each other by the weapons they carried, by the oils they prepared, by shared knowledge of craft outsiders did not comprehend. These encounters were brief, relationships professional rather than warm. Witchers were not known for sociability, but information was exchanged. One might mention a smith in a particular town who produced adequate whetstones. Another might share that a herbalist in the north stocked rare ingredients useful for certain preparations. These fragments of practical intelligence helped individuals survive in isolation, created a loose network of those who still practiced craft the world increasingly had no use for. Younger Witchers, those trained in the school's final years or by survivors after closure, understood they represented the tradition's end. No children were undergoing the trial of the grasses. The alchemical knowledge required to perform the transformation safely had been lost, possibly deliberately destroyed during attacks on school facilities. Even if the formulas could be recovered, few possessed the skill to execute the procedures. Creating Witchers had never been easy. Now it was impossible. This meant the profession had a timer. However many Witchers currently existed, that population would decline through attrition until none remained. Decades, perhaps. A few might live a century or more, their mutations granting extended lifespans. But eventually, the last one would fail to return from his final contract, and the craft of hunting monsters professionally would end. The world would adapt. It always did. Monsters were declining anyway, their populations reduced by habitat loss and systematic hunting over centuries. Perhaps humans would develop other methods for dealing with remaining threats. Perhaps they would simply accept losses, the occasional settlement destroyed, considered unfortunate, but not worth addressing systematically. The blades would outlast their wielders. Steel does not age, does not tire, does not lose purpose. A sword forged in Kaer Morhen's prime could function perfectly centuries after creation, assuming it was maintained and not damaged beyond repair. When the last Witcher died, his weapons would remain, potentially for generations, until someone who had no understanding of their significance melted them down for raw materials, or hung them on a wall as decoration. The runes inscribed on such blades would persist unchanged. Whether they retained function without someone to wield the weapon was unclear. Runes operated through principles not fully understood. Perhaps they required a wielder. Perhaps they worked purely through the blade's inherent properties. No one would know, because no one would be testing them. The oil formulas might survive in a different form. Herbalists and alchemists maintained their own traditions, passed knowledge through different structures than Witcher schools had used. Some Witcher formulas had been shared with such practitioners over the years, either through deliberate teaching or reverse engineering from purchased examples. These recipes might persist as curiosities, exotic preparations that nominally were designed for monster hunting, but had no practical application once monsters and monster hunters both became extinct. A scholar in some distant future might discover documentation of oil formulas, might find descriptions of forging techniques, might read about witchers and the specialized weapons they carried. That scholar would not be able to recreate what was described. The instructions were incomplete, the context missing, the accumulated expertise that made procedures work reliably not transmissible through written record alone. The craft would become historical, something that had existed once but no longer did, like so many other traditions that flourished briefly and then vanished as circumstances changed. The steel would remain in collections, displayed as artifacts from an era when monsters required hunting, and those who hunted them carried specific tools made according to now law specifications. A few practitioners understood all of this clearly. They maintained their practice anyway, not from hope of preserving the tradition, but from professional obligation. A witcher maintained his weapons because that was what witchers did. He prepared his oils because contracts required it. He walked the path not to ensure the craft's survival, but because it was the only life he knew, the only purpose his training had prepared him for. The resignation was not despair, simply acceptance. The world was changing in ways that made witchers obsolete. Fighting that change was pointless. Adapting was impossible. What else was a witcher qualified to do? Accepting the inevitable and continuing to function professionally until circumstances prevented further function was the only available option. Younger witchers sometimes asked their elders why they continued. Why maintain weapons that would not be replaced when broken? Why perfect oil formulas that would die with them? Why hunt monsters that paid less each year as contracts became scarcer? The answers varied but carried similar themes. Because the work was real. Because monsters still killed people even if they did so less frequently. Because maintaining standards in the face of decline was itself meaningful, even if the meaning benefited no one except those who chose to maintain those standards. A witcher might spend hours carefully applying oil to a blade before a contract that paid barely enough to cover his expenses. The preparation was disproportionate to the reward, but the preparation was not performed for reward. It was performed because correct preparation was how witchers operated. The economic irrationality of maintaining such standards did not make them less mandatory to those who had internalized them completely. This was craft practiced for its own sake, not for external validation or practical benefit. The work remained meaningful to those who performed it regardless of whether anyone else recognized that meaning or whether circumstances justified the effort involved. The steel accepted this care without awareness. A blade prepared according to refined procedures performed identically to one prepared according to abbreviated methods. Assuming the abbreviated methods were adequate, the metal did not reward extra effort with superior function. It simply cut as its edge and enhancements allowed. But the witcher who maintained his weapon properly knew the difference. Knew he was operating according to standards that had meaning, even if that meaning existed primarily within his own understanding. The blade might not know. The world might not care. The distinction remained significant to him. This was what survived of the tradition, not the infrastructure, not the knowledge preserved institutionally, not the systematic training that produced competent practitioners reliably. What survived was commitment to craft among individuals who understood they were practicing something that would die with them. Some blades had stories. A silver sword forged at Kaer Morhen before the massacre that survived the attack because its owner was traveling. The blade served multiple witchers across 7 decades, each receiving it from the previous wielder who had chosen him specifically as worthy inheritor. The current bearer understood he would not find another. The responsibility was his to maintain the weapon until circumstances prevented continuation, then to ensure it was treated respectfully rather than melted for scrap. I talk about steel sword commissioned from a dwarven smith in the early 13th century, inscribed with runes whose specific effects the current owner did not fully understand, but which provably enhanced the weapon's cutting power. The smith who created it had been killed during anti-dwarf violence decades earlier. His techniques died with him. The sword remained, maintained carefully. Its origins known but not replicable. A pair of blades, steel and silver, that had belonged to a witcher who died at Sodden Hill during battles against invading southern forces. They were recovered by a survivor who knew their owner only by reputation. He carried them as backups to his own weapons, maintaining them not because he needed them, but because letting them corrode would have been disrespectful to one who died defending the North. These objects were more than tools. They were physical links to people, and traditions that no longer existed in any other form. Carrying them, maintaining them, using them in the work they were designed for, this was memory made tangible, history preserved through practice rather than documentation. When witchers met, they sometimes discussed their weapons, not boasting, not comparing, simply sharing information about objects they lived with constantly. One might mention that his silver sword's runes were beginning to wear shallow, might ask if anyone knew a runewright who could reinscribe them properly. Another might show stress fractures appearing in his steel blade's tang, might receive advice about whether the weapon could be saved or was approaching catastrophic failure. These conversations were technical but carried emotional weight. The weapons were expensive, irreplaceable, essential to survival. A blade failing represented professional crisis. Others who understood this responded with practical information when available, with acknowledgement when no solution existed. No one pretended. When a weapon was failing and could not be adequately replaced, that fact was stated plainly. The affected witcher might express frustration but not despair. Tools broke, new tools were obtained, or one ceased working. The emotional content remained muted, professional, but the knowledge was present underneath the practical discussion. Each blade that failed and could not be properly replaced reduced the profession's capability. Each time a witcher had to accept inferior equipment, the tradition degraded further. The decline was visible, measurable, irreversible. The oils were easier in one sense. A witcher could teach oil preparation to someone who showed aptitude and interest. The knowledge could be passed laterally, outside the formal master-apprentice structures schools had used. This meant alchemical expertise might outlast the witchers themselves, might persist among herbalists and alchemists who maintained it as historical curiosity, even after no one hunted monsters professionally. Forging knowledge had no such path to survival. The work was specialized, required years of training, demanded access to specific materials and equipment. A blacksmith who had spent his life making common implements could not suddenly learn to forge witcher blades even if comprehensively instructed. The skill was too complex, the standards too demanding. Some witchers had attempted to document their weapon maintenance knowledge, creating detailed notes about care procedures in hopes that future individuals might find them useful. These documents were fragmentary and probably inadequate. Written instruction could not replace demonstration, but the effort represented acknowledgement that the tradition was ending, and some attempt should be made to preserve what could be preserved. Most witchers made no such effort. They maintained their weapons, did their work, and expected that when they died, their knowledge would die with them. This was not fatalism, but realism. What would be the purpose of documentation that no one would use? The profession was dying because it had no future recruitment. Without new witchers, preserving witcher knowledge served no function. The path continued to be walked, but the walkers were fewer each season. Contracts that once would have been taken were ignored, considered not worth the travel time relative to expected payment. Witchers became selective, accepting only work that paid adequately or that interested them personally. This selectivity reduced their visibility. Common folk who had grown accustomed to witchers appearing when monster problems arose found themselves without that resource. Local militia had to attempt contracts they were ill-equipped to handle. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they died. The gap witchers had filled for centuries was closing not because it was being filled by others, but because those who needed that gap filled were adapting to doing without. Monster populations continued declining. The trend had been visible for generations and showed no signs of reversing. Humans were effective at killing things, at destroying habitats, at making landscapes unsuitable for creatures that required specific conditions. Whether this was deliberate policy or merely side effect of human expansion made little difference to the results. A few monster species had already gone extinct in certain regions. Creatures once common enough to be serious threats were now so rare that confirmed sightings drew comment. Even lesser beings were becoming uncommon enough that contracts for their extermination rarely materialized. This should have been celebrated as success. Centuries of systematic hunting had achieved its implicit goal. making the world safer for humans by reducing monster populations to manageable levels. But the success made witchers obsolete. They had solved the problem they existed to address. The remaining witchers felt little satisfaction in this outcome. They had not chosen the profession from desire to make themselves unnecessary. They hunted because they had been trained to hunt, because it was work they could do, because contracts provided income that allowed continued survival. The nobility of making the world safer was incidental at best. Now that work was vanishing. The skills they had spent their lives developing had diminishing application. They were like master craftsmen in a trade made obsolete by changing circumstances, still highly skilled, still capable of exceptional work, but working in a field no one required anymore. A witcher in his 70s, who had survived decades on the path, who carried blades that had served him faithfully through hundreds of contracts, who could prepare oils for dozens of creature types from memory, who knew fighting techniques refined through generations of accumulated experience. That witcher had become an anachronism. His expertise was impressive, but irrelevant. The world was moving past him. Some accepted this with equanimity. They had expected to die on the path, expected violence to claim them long before they reached old age. The fact that they survived to see the profession itself dying was unexpected good fortune. They would continue while they could, stop when they could not, and consider themselves lucky to have lived as long as they had doing work they knew how to do. Others struggled with purposelessness. A life built entirely around monster hunting offered no clear alternatives when monster hunting became untenable. Witchers were not trained for anything else. Their mutations made them suspect to common folk even when their professional services were not required. Integrating into normal society was difficult at best. A handful attempted other work, guard duty, caravan protection, occasionally military service. These provided income but not the same sense of purpose. The work used similar physical skills but lacked the depth that came from understanding specialized knowledge, from preparing specialized tools, from facing creatures whose capabilities exceeded human limits. The result was a population of individuals who were among the most skilled warriors alive, carrying weapons that represented pinnacle achievements of specialized craft, maintaining expertise that centuries had refined, all drifting into obsolescence because circumstances no longer required what they provided. The steel they carried had no opinion about this. A blade served its purpose indifferent to whether that purpose was valued or dismissed by the surrounding culture. The weapons witchers maintained would continue functioning long after the last witcher had died, ready to cut whatever they were directed to cut by whoever eventually claimed them. Perhaps some distant descendant would find a witcher blade and wonder about the traditions that had produced it. The weapon itself could not explain. The inscriptions on its surface were decorative to those who could not read their meaning. The quality of the metallurgy was evident, but the specific techniques that had achieved it were not discoverable through examination. The craft lived only in practice. When practice ceased, the craft died, leaving only products that survived as mute testimony to traditions that had created them. The steel that remembered could not teach. It could only demonstrate through its continuing function that something worth preserving had been lost. For now, the work continued. A witcher might still ride into a settlement where creatures terrorized residents, might still negotiate a contract, might still prepare his weapons with care, refined through years of practice. He would hunt, he would kill, he would claim his payment. The cycle repeated until circumstances prevented repetition. The tradition was dying. Everyone involved knew this, accepting the inevitable while maintaining standards anyway. This was what remained of witchercraft in its final years. Not hope for continuation, not successful preservation of knowledge, not institutional survival. Simply individuals continuing to work according to principles they maintained, because those principles were worth maintaining, whether anyone else agreed or not. The steel accepted the care it was given. The oils enhanced the blades they were applied to. The work was performed as correctly as those who performed it knew how. When the last witcher completed his final contract, when the last oil was prepared, when the last blade was cleaned and sharpened, according to procedures developed over centuries, the tradition would end. But not yet, not quite yet. While witchers still walked the path, while monsters still existed to hunt, while blades still accepted enhancement and struck with precision refined through practice, while these conditions persisted, the craft remained alive, diminished, endangered, clearly approaching extinction, but alive. The steel that remembered would outlast those who maintained it, would survive into a future where no one understood what it represented, or why it had been created. But in the present, it served those who required its service. Enhanced by preparations they applied according to formulas they maintained. Wielded by hands trained to use it properly, this was enough. It had to be. Nothing more was possible. The work continued while it could. That continuation was what remained of tradition that had once shaped how an entire profession approached its craft. The forge fires were cold. The knowledge was fragmenting. The practitioners were dying. But the blades were sharp, the oils were potent, and somewhere a witcher was preparing to honor a contract using tools made according to standards that would die with him. The steel, indifferent to history and ignorant of its own obsolescence, held its edge and waited to be used. Those seeking to understand more about the world the conjunction created, about the practices that shaped how humans adapted to supernatural threats, may find value in exploring how other traditions emerged and evolved during that transformative period. The craft described here represents one strand of larger changes that remade how civilization functioned after reality itself had been wounded. Share this understanding with others who value knowledge of how adaptation occurs when circumstances demand choices that seem impossible. Yes.